Cities drive progress by concentrating people, ideas, and energy. Yet the most desirable often resist change, protecting charm or stability at the cost of openness. Politics, markets, culture, geography, and fear of social change combine to stall adaptation. Like species in nature, some cities coast, fragment, or make only partial compromises, leaving them fragile. Case studies from San Francisco, Berlin, Lagos, Tokyo, and others reveal how resistance deepens inequality and weakens resilience. The stakes are clear. Cities that adapt remain inclusive and dynamic. Those that refuse risk becoming monuments to the past rather than communities with a future. Cities have always carried a kind of paradox. They draw people in with the promise of growth, opportunity, and culture. They thrive on diversity, mixing different groups together in ways that spark new ideas and unexpected forms of life. A crowded city block can hold a dozen languages, countless small businesses, and a rhythm of exchange that makes the city feel alive. For centuries, cities have been the places where revolutions begin, where art movements take root, and where new industries emerge. They push economies forward and challenge the norms of the societies around them. Yet the same cities that become symbols of progress often resist change when it matters most. Once a city grows desirable, it often turns protective, unwilling to risk what it already has. The tension lies in this contradiction. The very qualities that make cities successful, openness, energy, and reinvention, are the ones they struggle to maintain as they mature. The city that shuts its doors may keep a certain charm intact, but in doing so, it risks closing itself off from the forces that made it great in the first place. Nature offers a set of metaphors for this tension. Some species thrive precisely because they adapt quickly. Raccoons, for example, flourish in urban environments because they adjust their habits to fit the conditions around them. They eat what they find, live where they can, and shift without hesitation. Their flexibility makes them resilient. On the other hand, certain animals lose ground when they fail to adjust. Rats can overwhelm a system until it fragments under their own weight, but they struggle when conditions change beyond their narrow range. Lizards in isolated environments sometimes stagnate, unable to evolve in response to new pressures, leaving them vulnerable. Cities follow similar paths. Some bend and grow stronger, others cling to their old forms until they harden and break. This paradox comes into sharper focus when we look at cities that are admired worldwide but face deep internal struggles. San Francisco serves as a clear example. The city holds global importance as the center of the tech industry. Its economy produces wealth on a massive scale. Its companies shape how people live across the planet, and its culture still draws dreamers in search of opportunity. Yet beneath that image, San Francisco struggles with paralysis. Its housing crisis has become a defining feature. While demand for homes has soared, the city's capacity to build has stalled. Regulatory battles, neighborhood resistance, and political gridlock have combined to make new housing painfully slow and expensive to produce. As a result, prices rise beyond reach, pushing workers and families out. While those who stay face extremes of wealth and poverty side by side. The irony is stark. A city built on innovation cannot solve the practical challenge of shelter. The refusal to adapt has created conditions of exclusivity that shape every corner of life. Workers commute from further away, straining transportation systems. Small businesses lose staff who can no longer afford rent. Communities hollow out, leaving only those able to pay at the top of the market. In this way, San Francisco mirrors the problem that faces many successful cities. When they fear change, they end up reinforcing inequality and creating vulnerability. A place designed to welcome new talent becomes a fortress protecting the status quo. Other cities offer similar lessons. Some neighborhoods in New York or London treat change as a threat to tradition, even when it might open doors for more people to share in what makes the area valuable. Resistance often comes from a desire to preserve a certain character, but that preservation can drift into exclusion. When housing, infrastructure, or public services cannot evolve, the city risks losing the very diversity and dynamism that gave it strength. The paradox of the city is not simply about buildings or laws, but about mindset. A city that refuses to adapt locks itself into a brittle identity. That rigidity breeds exclusivity, pushing out those who might have contributed to the city's next phase of growth. It deepens inequality, as only the wealthy can maintain a foothold. And it creates vulnerability, because a city that will not change cannot respond when new challenges arrive, whether they are economic shocks, climate pressures, or cultural shifts. The refusal to evolve does not preserve greatness. It erodes it slowly from within. This paradox will remain central to the story of cities in the coming decades. Some will manage to balance their traditions with openness, finding ways to grow while still holding onto what makes them unique. Others will continue to resist until their refusal reshapes them in ways they never intended. The lesson is visible in both nature and history. Adaptation is survival, and survival in a city means more than clinging to what once worked. It means opening the doors again, even when it feels risky, because without change, the city risks losing the very qualities that drew people in the first place. Cities do not only face pressure from markets or geography. The way they govern themselves often holds the greatest influence over whether they grow or stall. Political and institutional structures can allow a city to adjust, or they can lock it into stasis. In practice, many urban areas find themselves trapped in gridlock. Homeowners, renters, and cultural groups resist change in different ways. Agencies overlap and clash. Leaders focus on the next election rather than the next generation. The outcome is a pattern of delay and paralysis, even in places that appear outwardly dynamic. The politics of resistance often falls under the label of NIMBYism, short for "not in my backyard." While the term suggests homeowners guarding property values, the reality is more complicated. Homeowners do resist new housing out of fear that construction will lower their investment. Yet renters may also push back, worried that redevelopment will lead to displacement. Cultural conservatives may oppose density out of a desire to preserve a neighborhood's identity. Even progressive groups can resist if they believe new growth threatens a community's social fabric. These forces come together to create a powerful bloc against change. Each group may differ in values, but all share a desire to slow or stop development near them. The effect is multiplied when governance is fragmented. A single city is often broken into dozens of districts, boards, and commissions, each with veto power. The Bay Area shows this problem with striking clarity. While the region functions as one economic unit, it is carved into scores of municipalities. Each city, suburb, and county guards its authority. Housing proposals in one area may stall because of local opposition, even if the region as a whole suffers from a shortage. Transit planning faces similar hurdles, with multiple agencies controlling different pieces of the system. A resident may live in one county, work in another, and commute through a third, yet no single authority manages the full picture. Instead of coordination, the result is endless negotiation, duplication of effort, and delays that add cost and uncertainty. San Francisco itself demonstrates how hyper-local veto power can overwhelm regional needs. Individual neighborhoods wield enormous influence through zoning laws and planning hearings. A single project may spend years in review, as different boards, committees, and community groups weigh in. Even minor changes can face appeals, lawsuits, or ballot measures. This process is framed as giving voice to residents, but the practical effect is to slow development to a crawl. While the tech industry has transformed the economy at global speed, the city's housing stock has expanded at a fraction of the pace needed. The imbalance reflects not just economics, but the political structure that allows any one group to block growth in the name of protecting local interests. New York City shows a different version of the same problem. The city operates with a strong central government, but local community boards hold significant sway over land use decisions. These boards are unelected, yet they shape what can and cannot be built in their districts. Their decisions often reflect the immediate concerns of residents rather than the long-term needs of the city. A plan for new housing may be rejected because of fears about traffic or shadows on nearby parks. Meanwhile, the citywide goal of expanding affordable housing falls short. The tension between local boards and citywide planning creates a mismatch. Leaders may promise thousands of new units, but the process of approval through fractured bodies ensures that many of those units never materialize. The push and pull between short-term and long-term priorities deepens the gridlock. Politicians respond to voters who demand quick results. A mayor might promise to freeze property taxes or halt unpopular projects to win support. These moves offer relief in the moment, but weaken the city's ability to prepare for the future. Housing, transit, and infrastructure require years of investment. Yet projects that stretch beyond a single term are easy to delay, since the benefits will not appear until long after current leaders leave office. The outcome is a cycle of postponement. Cities keep deferring the hard decisions until the problems grow too large to ignore. Against this backdrop, Tokyo offers a sharp counterpoint. The city and national government maintain a more centralized system with strong authority over housing policy. Rather than devolving power to small local bodies, Tokyo sets broad goals and uses tools to meet them. Zoning laws allow for greater flexibility, and the approval process is streamlined compared with American cities. Developers face fewer layers of review, and while residents can voice concerns, they cannot halt projects with the same ease. This structure reflects a policy choice. Tokyo treats housing as a collective need rather than a local privilege. The result is a city that continues to build at scale, keeping housing more affordable even as its population remains large and dense. Where New York and San Francisco face shortages, Tokyo continues to absorb new residents without the same degree of crisis. The contrast highlights the role of institutions in shaping outcomes. In the Bay Area, fragmentation means that regional problems rarely meet regional solutions. In New York, local boards can block progress even when citywide goals demand it. In Tokyo, a more unified structure allows policy to function at the scale of the city as a whole. Each system reflects choices about power and priorities. Fragmented systems give local groups control, but they also invite paralysis. Centralized systems risk alienating residents, but they can respond faster to pressing needs. The trade-off shapes whether cities grow or stagnate. The deeper issue lies in how cities define democracy at the urban scale. American cities often equate democracy with local veto power, giving every neighborhood the right to defend itself against change. This protects existing residents, but excludes those who might move in. It creates a kind of closed circle, where participation means keeping things the way they are. In contrast, Tokyo's model treats the city as a shared space where decisions must account for the needs of the larger population, including future residents. By centralizing authority, it expands the definition of who counts in urban politics. The tension between these models reveals why some cities build and others stall. Institutional design is not simply an abstract matter. It shapes whether workers can afford to live near jobs, whether families can remain in the communities they value, and whether the next generation of residents has a place in the city. Political and institutional gridlock does not appear by accident. It emerges from a structure that distributes power in ways that make growth nearly impossible. Until those structures shift, many cities will continue to struggle under the weight of their own contradictions. Cities do not exist outside of markets. They rise and fall with the industries that sustain them and the flows of money that shape their growth. When the economy of a city is balanced across sectors, it gains resilience. But when it leans too heavily on one source of wealth, the risks mount. Boom and bust cycles leave scars that take decades to heal, and real estate speculation distorts not only affordability, but the very structure of urban life. The story of cities cannot be told without tracing how economics and markets limit their capacity to grow. Detroit offers the clearest example of dependence on a single sector. The city became a global icon of industrial power because of the automobile. For decades, Jobs in car factories drew workers from across the country. Wages were high, unions strong, and neighborhoods thrived on the stability of steady employment. But the very success of the auto industry left Detroit vulnerable. When foreign competition rose, when automation reduced the need for labor, and when firms moved plants to other regions, the city had little to fall back on. Jobs vanished by the hundreds of thousands. Population followed, dropping from nearly 2 million at its peak to under 700,000 today. The tax base shrank, infrastructure decayed, and entire neighborhoods emptied out. What once seemed like an engine of endless growth became the anchor that dragged Detroit into decline. The lesson is clear. A city tied too closely to a single industry carries risk not only for workers, but for the long-term survival of the city itself. This pattern repeats in subtler forms elsewhere. Silicon Valley's dominance in technology has produced wealth on a global scale, but the Bay Area's reliance on this one sector creates fragility. A downturn in tech funding or a shift in innovation could ripple across housing, services, and local government budgets. Houston's history with oil follows the same trajectory. During booms, the city swells with jobs and investment. But when prices crash, the local economy suffers. Cities thrive in diversity, not just of people, but of industries. When economic life becomes one-dimensional, so too does the city's resilience. Real estate adds another layer of constraint. Housing is not only a necessity, but also a financial asset. When property becomes an investment vehicle, speculation distorts the function of housing as shelter. Vancouver illustrates this problem with striking clarity. Over the past 2 decades, the city has experienced one of the sharpest increases in housing prices anywhere in North America. Local wages have not kept pace, yet demand from global buyers has driven prices ever higher. Condominiums are purchased not for living but for holding value. Some sit empty, owned by investors who have no intention of renting them out. This practice contributes to what residents call ghost condos, where entire towers have dark windows at night because so few units are occupied. The city grows in physical size, yet the number of people who can afford to live in it shrinks. The paradox is that construction continues, but affordability worsens because housing has become disconnected from local need. Speculation also reshapes the social fabric of a city. Neighborhoods lose longtime residents as rents climb beyond reach. Local businesses struggle because their customer base erodes. Schools close when families leave. The city becomes a place where money resides rather than people. This hollowing out creates instability, even if the skyline suggests prosperity. The experience of Vancouver is not unique. Hong Kong faces similar pressures, where real estate functions more as a global financial instrument than a local resource. The result is inequality, frustration, and a growing divide between those who can access property and those who cannot. Global capital drives much of this dynamic. In an interconnected world, money seeks safe havens. Real estate in cities like London, New York, Vancouver, or Hong Kong offers investors security against political or economic uncertainty elsewhere. But the influx of capital into housing markets inflates prices far beyond what local incomes can sustain. Policymakers may attempt to cool the market with taxes on foreign buyers or restrictions on empty units, but capital finds ways around barriers. The outcome is the same. Housing stock is treated as a commodity rather than infrastructure for human life. The mismatch between the local purpose of shelter and the global function of investment deepens the crisis. At the other extreme, some cities face growth that outpaces infrastructure. Lagos in Nigeria shows how rapid expansion can overwhelm capacity. The city's population has surged past 20 million, making it one of the largest urban centers in the world. Economic growth has created opportunities, but the pace of change has strained the systems meant to support residents. Housing supply lags behind demand, leaving large numbers in informal settlements without secure tenure. Roads and public transport cannot keep up with the daily movement of millions, leading to gridlock and lost productivity. Water, sanitation, and electricity infrastructure fall short, forcing many households to rely on makeshift solutions. The market alone cannot fill these gaps. Yet government resources and planning tools struggle to match the scale of need. Lagos illustrates a different side of the economic constraint. Growth without the foundation of adequate infrastructure becomes unsustainable, leaving residents caught between opportunity and hardship. The interplay between industry cycles, speculation, and infrastructure shapes the destiny of cities as much as politics does. Detroit shows how dependence on a single sector can hollow out a city when that sector fails. Vancouver shows how speculative demand can transform housing from shelter into a scarce luxury, distorting the market for everyone else. Lagos shows how even rapid economic growth can leave residents behind if infrastructure does not expand in tandem. Each case demonstrates a form of constraint that makes urban life fragile. While the details differ, the underlying thread is that cities cannot escape the forces of markets. They can only find ways to navigate them, or else be defined by them. Cities are shaped not only by laws and markets, but also by ideas about what they should look like and who they should serve. Planning is more than a technical process of drawing maps or setting building codes. It is a philosophy that reflects culture, values, and history. In many places, the dominant ideology is preservation. Residents and leaders speak about protecting the character of a neighborhood, the charm of a city, or the stability of a community. These words carry emotional weight, but behind them lies a politics of exclusivity. Preservation can mean holding on to traditions, but it can also mean keeping newcomers out and limiting growth. Single-family zoning is one of the clearest tools used in the name of preservation. In large parts of American cities, entire districts are locked into this form of land use, where only detached homes are allowed. This zoning model took root in the 20th century as a way to separate uses and create suburban-style living within city limits. Once in place, it became hard to undo. Single-family zoning restricts density, which in turn restricts the number of people who can live in a neighborhood. It creates stability for existing residents, but it also raises costs by limiting supply. When paired with height limits and strict land use regulations, it ensures that cities cannot easily grow to match demand. What looks like stability from one perspective is in practice a barrier to adaptation. Los Angeles demonstrates how deeply these zoning rules shape a city. Despite its image as a sprawling metropolis, much of Los Angeles remains dominated by single-family lots. Efforts to allow denser housing often face intense resistance. Homeowners argue that apartments will alter the feel of their neighborhoods, bring traffic, or strain local services. City council meetings draw fierce debates where preservation is framed as defending the identity of the city. The result is a patchwork of land that resists new construction, even as housing demand explodes. Younger residents and lower-income workers are squeezed out, while older homeowners benefit from rising property values. Los Angeles embodies the cultural weight of preservation. The desire to freeze a particular image of the city, even when the needs of the population change. The growth control movements that emerged in the latter half of the 20th century reflect this same impulse. They gained traction in cities where residents feared that rapid development would erode quality of life. Ballot measures imposed caps on building permits, slowed approvals, and limited outward expansion. These measures were often justified as protecting open space, controlling congestion, or keeping communities from becoming unrecognizable. Yet they also became tools that constrained supply and reinforced exclusivity. Growth control promised to preserve community character, but it also hardened divisions between those who owned property and those trying to gain access to it. The philosophy behind these movements was cultural as much as economic, rooted in identity and nostalgia. Venice provides a striking European example of preservation ideology taken to its extreme. The city is one of the most visited places in the world, and its charm lies in the very features that residents and officials have worked to protect: canals, historic buildings, and a sense of timelessness. Tourism sustains the economy, but it also overwhelms daily life. Preservation has focused on maintaining the appearance of the city for visitors, but the local population has steadily declined. Housing costs have risen, short-term rentals dominate, and younger residents find few opportunities. The city risks becoming an empty stage set, where preservation of identity turns into depopulation. Venice illustrates how preservation can shift from defending community to hollowing it out, as the needs of residents are sacrificed to maintain a cultural image. The cultural dimension of planning also appears in places where progressive ideals dominate policy. Portland, Oregon, has long promoted itself as a forward-thinking city with strong environmental values. In the 1970s, it adopted an urban growth boundary, a tool designed to protect farmland and curb sprawl. The boundary has succeeded in preserving green space and creating a clear edge to urban development. But it has also limited expansion in ways that contribute to rising housing costs. Within the boundary, land values rise as demand grows, and restrictive zoning adds further pressure. Residents defend the policy as essential to the city's identity, reflecting a cultural commitment to sustainability and community stability. Yet the trade-off is real. Affordability suffers, and newcomers face barriers to entry. Portland shows how even progressive preservation can create constraints when ideals collide with practical needs. Identity and nostalgia are powerful forces in planning. Residents may feel a deep attachment to the way their neighborhood looked when they arrived, or to the rhythms of life they have grown accustomed to. They see new construction as a threat not only to physical space, but to memory and belonging. This cultural resistance often outweighs abstract arguments about supply and demand. A developer can show data about housing shortages, but a resident may see only the loss of a familiar street corner. Policymakers respond to these emotions because they carry political weight. Planning becomes a battleground where memory and community pride clash with the necessity of change. Community stability is often cited as the justification for restrictive policies. Leaders argue that limits on density protect schools, keep services predictable, and prevent displacement. Yet stability can mean exclusion when it prevents adaptation. A neighborhood that stays physically the same may look stable, but its population changes as rising prices push out long-time renters and prevent younger families from moving in. What appears as preservation of community may in fact be the slow replacement of one community with another. The cultural defense of stability masks the economic reality of exclusion. These patterns reveal how planning culture and philosophy shape the capacity of cities to evolve. In Los Angeles, single-family zoning preserves a vision of suburban life at the expense of density. In Venice, the drive to protect historic character sustains tourism but accelerates depopulation. In Portland, environmental ideals produce a boundary that contains growth but inflates costs. Across these cases, preservation is more than a technical policy choice. It is an ideology rooted in culture, identity, and memory. It reflects a desire to hold on to a certain vision of the city, even when conditions demand change. The cost of this philosophy is borne by those who cannot find a place within its narrow definition of community. Cities are never built on blank slates. Their growth is shaped by the land beneath them and the infrastructure that past generations left behind. Mountains, rivers, coasts, and wetlands set boundaries that human engineering can only partly overcome. At the same time, the roads, pipes, bridges, and grids laid down decades earlier continue to direct how people live and move. Infrastructure both enables growth and constrains it. When it becomes outdated or rigid, it locks cities into patterns that no longer fit present needs. Geography and infrastructure together act as invisible walls, limiting how far a city can evolve. Manhattan shows this tension in sharp detail. As an island, it has natural boundaries that have defined its growth since the first settlements. Bridges and tunnels connect it to surrounding boroughs, but these choke points create limits on movement. The cost of adding capacity is staggering, so the existing links bear the strain of millions of commuters. Within the island, infrastructure has also created divides. Uptown and downtown developed in different ways, and the subway system reflects decisions made a century ago. Entire neighborhoods remain underserved because of the routes chosen in the early 20th century. The result is a city where growth is uneven, and opportunities concentrate in areas with better access. Scientists studying rats in New York have noted that populations uptown and downtown remain genetically distinct because physical and infrastructural barriers block movement. The same principle applies to human life. Highways, rivers, and subways create invisible borders that shape identity, opportunity, and inequality. Historical legacies weigh heavily on American cities more broadly. The mid-20th century push for highways prioritized cars over other forms of transit. Entire neighborhoods were cut through by freeways that now serve as both physical and social barriers. Once built, these massive structures are hard to remove. They dictate how traffic flows, where development occurs, and which communities are isolated. Car-centric planning shaped land use patterns that persist even when cities try to encourage public transit. Parking requirements, wide arterial roads, and sprawling layouts remain because the infrastructure beneath them is expensive to undo. Cities become locked into decisions made by earlier generations, even when those choices no longer serve the needs of today. New Orleans provides a case where geography and infrastructure collide with existential stakes. Built on low-lying land between the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain, the city depends on levees and pumps to hold back water. The physical geography makes expansion difficult, as much of the surrounding land is flood-prone. Infrastructure is both lifeline and constraint. Levees provide protection but also create a false sense of security, encouraging settlement in areas still at risk. When Hurricane Katrina struck, the failure of this infrastructure revealed the fragility of the entire system. Rebuilding levees and pumps has been costly, and the threat of rising seas adds pressure to a city already stretched thin. Here, the analogy of infrastructure as a blocker of gene flow is literal. Waterways, levees, and canals segment neighborhoods, limit movement, and create pockets of isolation. What appears as a technical system for flood control also functions as a boundary that shapes urban life and vulnerability. São Paulo illustrates another form of infrastructural constraint: the sheer weight of traffic and the limits of investment. The city has grown into one of the largest in the world, yet its transportation system has not kept pace. Car ownership rose faster than the ability to build roads or expand transit. Highways and arterial roads are clogged for hours each day, turning commutes into ordeals that shape where people can work and live. Investments in metro and bus systems have lagged behind demand, leaving many neighborhoods underserved. Congestion is more than inconvenience. It reduces productivity, increases pollution, and deepens inequality because wealthier residents can buy homes closer to jobs or pay for private transport, while poorer residents lose hours each day in traffic. Infrastructure here acts as a ceiling. Without major expansion and modernization, the city cannot move people efficiently enough to sustain inclusive growth. Utilities also form a less visible but equally constraining layer. Water pipes, electrical grids, and sewer systems often date back many decades. Upgrading them costs billions, requires disrupting daily life, and faces political resistance. Yet without these upgrades, cities struggle to add density. A new high-rise may not be possible if the sewer lines below cannot handle additional waste. Expanding affordable housing becomes harder if water pressure and electrical capacity are already at their limits. Infrastructure in this sense becomes a bottleneck, forcing planners to work within outdated systems. Residents may never see these constraints, but they feel them in the form of higher costs, delays, and limits on growth. The analogy to evolution helps explain why infrastructure exerts such influence. In biology, gene flow allows populations to mix, adapt, and grow stronger. Barriers like mountains, rivers, or deserts limit that flow, leaving populations fragmented and vulnerable. In cities, infrastructure acts in the same way. Highways, rivers, and outdated grids become barriers that block the free movement of people, jobs, and services. They create isolated pockets that evolve separately, often reinforcing inequality. Uptown and downtown New York rats diverge because they cannot cross the human-made boundaries of the city. Human communities experience the same fragmentation when cut off by inadequate transit or surrounded by physical barriers. Adaptation becomes harder, and resilience weakens. Geography magnifies these effects, by placing natural limits on where cities can expand. Mountain ranges hem in Los Angeles, forcing sprawl into valleys and deserts. Coastlines constrain San Francisco and Hong Kong, leading to extreme land values. Rivers divide cities like Cairo or London, with bridges becoming vital choke points. While engineering can overcome some barriers, the cost is immense. Tunnels under rivers or seawalls against rising tides require vast resources. Even when built, they channel growth into narrow corridors rather than freeing it entirely. Geography sets the frame, and infrastructure builds within it, creating constraints that last for generations. In each case, the story is the same. The physical and infrastructural skeleton of a city defines its possibilities. Manhattan's island geography and century-old subway lines dictate how people move and where they live. New Orleans struggles against water, with levees both protecting and endangering it. Sao Paulo is suffocated by congestion and underbuilt transit. Across cities, outdated utilities and historical planning choices prevent adaptation even when demand for growth is high. These constraints act like evolutionary barriers, blocking the free flow of people and ideas. The city becomes less flexible, less able to respond to change, and more vulnerable to shocks. The very systems that made growth possible in the past become the obstacles of the present. Cities do not only wrestle with physical limits or political gridlock. They also face the anxieties of social change. As populations shift, cultures mix, and classes collide, resistance grows. Change brings opportunity for some, but fear for others. Homeowners worry about property values. Renters fear displacement. Long-standing communities fear cultural erasure. The conflict is often framed as gentrification versus preservation, but beneath both lies the same fear: the loss of stability in a moving world. San Francisco's Mission District captures this tension sharply. Long the cultural heart of the city's Latino community, it became a target of tech-driven development. Wealthy newcomers moved in, and rents rose beyond reach. Longtime residents faced eviction or impossible increases. Cafes and luxury apartments became symbols of displacement rather than prosperity. Protests followed. Activists blocked buses carrying tech workers and fought evictions. The resistance was not only about rent, but about identity. Yet even proposals for affordable housing met fierce opposition, as residents feared they would speed up gentrification. The paradox was clear. In trying to protect the community, opposition to new housing reinforced the scarcity that fueled displacement. Berlin has lived through a similar struggle on a different scale. Known for affordability and tenant rights, the city has long been a haven for artists, students, and working-class families. Rising demand, however, has strained this model. Rents have climbed, speculation has grown, and demonstrations against luxury development are now common. Protesters demand rent caps and even the expropriation of large landlords. Yet new housing proposals often face opposition from the same groups. Residents fear that development will worsen the very trend they resent. The city is torn between preserving affordability and building enough homes to meet demand. The cultural memory of cheap rent collides with scarcity, and protest becomes both a form of protection and a barrier to change. London shows the same contradiction in another form. Under immense pressure to house millions, it faces resistance to high-rise development in historic neighborhoods. Glass towers are viewed as intrusions on local character, casting shadows over parks and dwarfing centuries-old buildings. Yet blocking such projects pushes prices ever higher, excluding younger and poorer residents. The clash is stark: preservation of character versus the need to expand supply. The paradox cuts deep into the city's progressive image. London celebrates diversity and openness, but in planning debates, many communities resist the very changes that would allow newcomers to stay. The paradox of progressive cities rejecting progressive housing solutions is visible across the urban world. San Francisco, Berlin, and London all lean left politically, with commitments to equality and inclusion. Yet when proposals threaten local stability, the same voters often resist. They frame opposition in moral terms, preserving culture, defending affordability, protecting neighborhoods. Yet the result is exclusionary. Scarcity drives prices higher, locking out the very groups progressive policies claim to support. Cities that stand as symbols of tolerance become fortresses when faced with demographic change. Fear of social change is not irrational. Renters who have seen friends displaced by rising costs have reason to worry. Homeowners who have invested life savings in property are right to care about its value. Communities with deep cultural histories want to defend them against erasure, but these fears often lead to policies that make problems worse. By resisting growth, cities make displacement more likely. By blocking new housing, they push prices upward. The mechanisms differ: rent hikes in Berlin, gentrification in San Francisco, tower opposition in London. But the underlying anxiety is shared. It is easier to argue about numbers than about identity. A planner can show projections of housing demand, but that does not soothe the fear of losing a mural-covered street or a neighborhood market. Preservation appeals to emotion, and emotion outweighs data. Stability depends on conditions that no longer exist, yet residents cling to them, and fear of social change becomes an anchor. It holds communities in place but prevents adaptation. The result is a cycle of resistance and scarcity. As cities grow more desirable, demand rises. Communities resist change to protect themselves, but resistance worsens the very pressures they fear. In San Francisco, activists reject housing that might ease rents. In Berlin, tenants oppose development that could relieve scarcity. In London, residents defend cultural character, while younger families are priced out. Fear of change traps cities in patterns that reinforce inequality. Cities, like living systems, adapt to their environments in ways that resemble biological evolution. They respond to pressures, find compromises, and sometimes fail when conditions shift too quickly. Some thrive without major changes, much like raccoons that survive by exploiting almost any environment. A city with a famous cultural scene or industrial cluster can attract people even while resisting growth. But this adaptability has limits. When housing shortages, climate risks, or economic shocks arrive, cities that avoided meaningful change find themselves exposed. Stability proves fragile when pressures mount. Other cities fragment like populations of rats divided by highways. Infrastructure creates barriers that isolate neighborhoods, hardening social and economic boundaries. Residents cut off from jobs and services are locked into cycles of disadvantage. The city weakens because the exchange that gives it vitality is broken, leaving some districts stagnant while others thrive. Still others resemble lizards, surviving harsh environments with partial adaptations. Mexico City offers the clearest example. Faced with smog that threatened public health, officials imposed car restrictions and other temporary measures. Pollution eased somewhat, but deeper causes, car dependence, weak transit, sprawling growth, remained. The city survived but stayed vulnerable, adapting enough to persist but not to flourish. Cities also rely on cosmetic change, like organisms that adjust appearance without altering structure. Leaders launch flashy projects or pilot programs that signal innovation while leaving fundamentals untouched. Downtowns may gain bike lanes or parks while housing shortages deepen. Sustainability may be championed even as power grids remain outdated. These shallow adaptations offer short-term survival but not long-term resilience. The collapse of many Rust Belt towns shows the danger. Once thriving on heavy industry, they tried to reinvent themselves with cultural projects and beautification. These efforts brought brief hope but could not replace the lost economic foundation. Without deeper adaptation, populations shrank, tax bases eroded, and services declined. Incremental fixes reveal the same limits. Mexico City still struggles with congestion, pollution, and water shortages. Other cities patch transit, build token affordable units, or repair infrastructure piecemeal. These efforts provide relief without solving root problems. They are evolutionary tweaks that extend survival without ensuring success. Populations persist, but vulnerability accumulates. Full transformation is rare because it requires political will, resources, and cultural acceptance. Incrementalism becomes the default, even when it locks cities into fragility. The evolutionary metaphor highlights the trade-offs. Thriving without evolving works only until the environment changes. Fragmentation creates local stability but weakens the whole. Compromises extend survival but limit growth. Cosmetic fixes soothe fears but leave vulnerabilities. Cities succeed when they adapt at the right scale and speed. When they fail, consequences echo across generations. The smog of Mexico City, the decline of the Rust Belt, the divided neighborhoods of great metropolises all show what happens when adaptation falls short. Cities, like living systems, adapt to their environments in ways that resemble biological evolution. They respond to pressures, find compromises, and sometimes fail to keep up when conditions change too quickly. Borrowing metaphors from ecology and evolution helps make sense of why some cities endure while others stagnate or collapse. A species may thrive without major changes, as raccoons do, by exploiting whatever resources they find. Others fragment into smaller groups when barriers divide them, like rats in neighborhoods cut off by highways. Some make awkward compromises, adapting enough to survive but not enough to flourish, much like lizards in isolated environments. And still others reach the limits of their flexibility, relying on cosmetic changes that do not address deeper needs. Cities mirror these patterns, showing both the possibilities and the limits of adaptation. The raccoon metaphor fits cities that coast on past advantages. Raccoons succeed not because they evolve into something new, but because they can exploit almost any environment. In the same way, some cities remain attractive without changing much. They rely on geography, history, or reputation to sustain them. For a time, this strategy works. A city with a famous cultural scene or a cluster of industries may keep drawing people even as it resists new growth. But like raccoons, this adaptability has limits. Conditions may shift in ways that require deeper transformation. If the city has avoided meaningful change, its resilience may prove weaker than it appears. Prosperous cities that pride themselves on stability can find themselves suddenly exposed when pressures mount, whether from housing shortages, climate risks, or economic shocks. Fragmented populations show another side of urban evolution. Biologists note that when groups of animals are cut off by barriers, they diverge, sometimes weakening as their gene pool narrows. In cities, infrastructure often plays this role. Highways, rivers, and rail lines carve neighborhoods into isolated pockets. These divisions harden social and economic boundaries, creating areas that develop in parallel but rarely interact. The rats of Manhattan, for instance, have distinct populations uptown and downtown because the built environment prevents them from mixing. Human communities experience a similar fate. A neighborhood cut off by a freeway may lack access to jobs, transit, or services, locking its residents into cycles of disadvantage. The fragmentation prevents the kind of exchange that gives cities their strength, leaving parts of the urban fabric stagnant while others thrive. The metaphor of lizards speaks to the compromises cities often make. Lizards in harsh environments can survive by adjusting their behavior or physiology in limited ways, but these adaptations are partial. They keep the species alive without allowing it to flourish. Urban planning often works in the same fashion. Cities introduce half measures to respond to crises, but stop short of full transformation. Mexico City offers a clear example. The city faced severe air pollution that threatened public health. In response, officials introduced policies like limiting car use on certain days. These measures brought temporary relief, but did not resolve the structural causes of smog, such as car dependence, weak transit systems, and unchecked sprawl. Over time, pollution levels improved somewhat, but the city remains vulnerable. Infrastructure projects continue in a patchwork fashion, leaving gaps that limit effectiveness. Like lizards making do in difficult conditions, Mexico City survives through partial adaptation rather than full renewal. Cosmetic change is another form of limited flexibility. In biology, plasticity allows organisms to adjust their appearance or behavior without altering their underlying structure. It provides short-term survival, but not long-term transformation. Cities often do the same. Leaders announce ambitious projects, rebrand neighborhoods, or launch pilot programs that look innovative but leave the fundamentals untouched. A downtown may add bike lanes and green spaces while its housing shortage deepens. A city may promote sustainability while relying on outdated power grids. These changes are visible but shallow, addressing symptoms without altering the system. The limits of this approach appear when deeper shocks arrive. Cosmetic adaptation cannot prevent collapse when the environment shifts too far. The collapse of many Rust Belt towns illustrates this limit. These cities thrived when heavy industry dominated the economy. When factories closed and jobs vanished, some tried cosmetic fixes, downtown beautification, small cultural projects, or tourism campaigns. These offered short bursts of hope, but did not replace the lost economic foundation. Without deeper adaptation, populations shrank, tax bases eroded, and services declined. Some towns have begun to reinvent themselves with new industries or educational hubs, but many remain locked in decline. The failure to evolve beyond a single economic model left them as vulnerable as species unable to adapt when their environment changed. Once the conditions that sustained them disappeared, survival became a struggle. Cities that adapt incrementally but ineffectively reveal the cost of partial solutions. Mexico City has tackled smog with small policies but continues to face crises of congestion, pollution, and water shortage. Other cities patch roads, expand transit in pieces, or add affordable housing in token amounts. These actions provide relief without solving core problems. They resemble evolutionary tweaks that extend survival without ensuring long-term success. Populations persist but do not thrive, and vulnerability accumulates. The pattern is common because full transformation requires political will, financial resources, and cultural acceptance, all of which are hard to achieve. Incrementalism becomes the default, even when it leads to fragility. The evolutionary metaphor highlights the trade-offs cities face. Thriving without evolving works only until the environment changes. Fragmentation creates local stability, but weakens the whole. Compromises extend survival, but limit growth. Plastic changes soothe fears, but leave deeper vulnerabilities. Cities, like species, succeed when they can adapt at the right scale and speed. When they fail, the results echo across generations. The smog of Mexico City, the decline of Rust Belt towns, the locked neighborhoods of divided metropolises. Each shows what happens when adaptation falls short. Cities often trap themselves in feedback loops that reinforce stagnation. Housing costs rise, which makes residents more protective of what they already have. Local opposition grows stronger, which restricts new supply. The shortage drives prices even higher, giving homeowners greater incentives to defend their position and deepening the exclusion of those who cannot keep up. The cycle turns wealth into rigidity and prosperity into inequality. Instead of adapting to demand, cities harden their defenses. The result is growth without openness, rising fortunes without inclusion, and development that stalls even as it appears to advance. San Francisco and the Bay Area show this pattern more clearly than almost anywhere else. The region became one of the wealthiest in the world through the rise of the tech industry. Jobs multiplied, investment poured in, and innovation spread globally. But as demand for housing increased, the region's ability to build lagged behind. Each city within the Bay Area exercised veto power over its own land, with neighborhood groups resisting higher density. Homeowners argued that new buildings would strain infrastructure or reduce the charm of their streets. Renters, worried about gentrification, sometimes opposed construction as well. The net effect was a severe restriction on supply. As fewer homes were built, prices rose at an extraordinary pace. Homeowners then had an even stronger reason to block change, since their wealth was tied to scarcity. The cycle reinforced itself. Today, San Francisco embodies the paradox of a region that produces immense wealth, yet struggles to house the people who generate it. The consequences extend beyond housing. Workers commute long distances because they cannot afford to live near jobs, clogging freeways and stressing transit systems. Small businesses struggle to hire because staff cannot pay local rents. Teachers, nurses, and service workers are forced out, leaving essential roles unfilled. The city and region remain global symbols of progress, but are internally paralyzed. The feedback loop has created a form of arrested development. Prosperity grows, but inclusivity declines. The promise of opportunity that once drew people now fades under the weight of exclusion. The city is both rich and brittle, powerful and fragile. Vancouver reveals a similar cycle shaped by global capital. Demand for housing surged not only from local residents, but also from international investors treating property as a safe asset. Prices climbed far beyond what local incomes could support. Residents, fearful of losing access to homes, resisted change. Neighborhood groups opposed denser construction, arguing that it would disrupt community character or worsen traffic. Governments introduced taxes and regulations aimed at curbing speculation, but these measures often failed to address the core issue, a lack of supply. As construction slowed or became tied up in debates, prices continued to rise. Homeowners benefited from escalating values, reinforcing their opposition to growth. Renters and younger families bore the cost, facing one of the least affordable housing markets in the world. Vancouver's feedback loop runs on both local resistance and global money. The city becomes wealthier on paper, but less accessible in practice, a place where growth hardens into exclusivity. These loops show how wealth can create fragility. Rising prices lock residents into positions where adaptation feels dangerous. Any new housing is framed as a threat to property values, neighborhood character, or cultural identity. The longer the cycle runs, the more entrenched it becomes. Political systems adapt to protect homeowners, who vote in higher numbers and wield greater influence. Regulations multiply, hearings drag on, and projects stall. Cities grow richer, but the wealth is concentrated in land and property rather than shared opportunity. Economic dynamism continues, but social mobility declines. The self-reinforcing loop ensures that progress at the regional scale comes with stagnation at the local one. The contrast with Houston shows that these cycles are not inevitable. Houston has long embraced a pro-growth philosophy with minimal zoning restrictions. Landowners retain broad freedom to develop, and the city allows housing supply to expand more rapidly than in highly regulated regions. As a result, Houston has been able to absorb population growth while keeping housing relatively more affordable compared with cities like San Francisco or Vancouver. Neighborhoods still resist change in certain cases, and infrastructure struggles to keep pace with rapid expansion, but the core loop is weaker. Rising demand leads to new construction rather than entrenched scarcity. Homeowners may not see the same extreme gains in property values, but more residents can enter the housing market. Houston demonstrates that looser regulation can interrupt the cycle of stagnation, though it introduces other challenges, such as sprawl, traffic, and vulnerability to flooding. Still, the contrast shows how different planning philosophies alter the dynamics of growth. The vicious circle of stagnation is powerful because it aligns the interests of those with the most influence. Homeowners benefit from rising prices. Local politicians depend on their support. Regulators face pressure to slow growth in the name of preservation. Renters and future residents, who suffer the most, lack the same organized voice. The result is a system that sustains itself, even as it fails to meet the needs of the broader population. Breaking the cycle requires more than technical solutions. It requires shifting the political and cultural logic that equates preservation with protection and scarcity with prosperity. San Francisco and Vancouver illustrate how these loops take root in different contexts, one fueled by local veto power, the other by global money. Both end in the same place: exclusion, inequality, and brittleness. Houston shows another path, where rapid growth at least prevents extreme scarcity, though at the cost of sprawl and infrastructure strain. The comparison underscores how cities shape their own destinies through the structures they build around growth. Feedback loops can trap them, or more flexible systems can keep them open. In either case, the cycle is not neutral. It defines who gets to belong in the city and who is left outside looking in. When cities refuse to adapt, the costs stretch far beyond housing shortages or slow planning processes. The refusal to grow up reshapes economies, divides societies, undermines climate goals, and erodes faith in politics. A city can appear prosperous on the surface, with gleaming offices and busy streets, yet underneath it may be hollowing out. The paradox is that success itself often creates the fear of change. Cities that once embodied openness become resistant to it, and the consequences play out across multiple dimensions of life. Economically, exclusivity becomes the dominant feature. When housing supply is frozen, property values soar, and wealth concentrates in land rather than productive activity. Newcomers struggle to enter, and workers who might bring energy and ideas cannot afford to stay. Declining dynamism follows. A place like Silicon Valley thrives on innovation in technology, yet its local economy suffers from paralysis in housing. The region produces tools that connect billions of people, but cannot expand housing fast enough to shelter its own workforce. As a result, startups face higher costs because employees must commute from far away or demand higher wages to cover rent. Diversity of talent shrinks because only the wealthy or highly paid can remain. The paradox is striking. The most forward-looking industries operate in a landscape walked in the past. Dynamism survives in code and capital, but withers in the urban fabric that supports them. The social consequences are just as severe. Inequality deepens when cities resist growth. Housing scarcity divides generations. Older homeowners benefit from rising values, while younger residents find themselves locked out of ownership and even stable rental markets. A generational barrier forms, where wealth is inherited rather than earned. In San Francisco, longtime owners enjoy homes worth millions, while young workers crowd into small apartments or leave the region altogether. This imbalance erodes the sense of shared opportunity. Cities become places where belonging depends on timing rather than effort. Inequality also grows along class and cultural lines, as lower-income workers are pushed to distant suburbs, losing access to jobs and services. What was once the promise of city life, diverse groups living and working together, breaks down into separation and resentment. Environmental costs follow from the same refusal to densify. When cities block higher density, people move further outward. Sprawl consumes land, increases reliance on cars, and drives up emissions. The failure to build compact, efficient neighborhoods undermines climate goals. A family priced out of central Paris may move to distant suburbs, adding hours of commuting and tons of carbon each year. A worker pushed out of Silicon Valley may drive long distances on congested freeways, worsening air quality and traffic. Cities that pride themselves on green values often miss the basic fact that density is one of the most effective climate tools. Tall buildings and transit-friendly development reduce energy use per person, yet local opposition prevents these solutions from scaling. The gap between climate rhetoric and planning reality widens, leaving cities unable to meet their own stated goals. The political consequences compound the damage. When residents see cities paralyzed, trust in institutions declines. Polarization grows as groups blame one another. Homeowners accuse newcomers of threatening stability. Renters accuse politicians of protecting the wealthy. And activists accuse developers of greed. Disillusionment spreads as people feel that decisions serve narrow interests rather than the common good. In Berlin, tenant protests show both the strength and frustration of political engagement. People march to demand protection, yet their opposition to new construction limits the solutions available. In Paris, attempts to balance preservation with affordability spark debates that cut across political lines. In Silicon Valley, progressives who support inclusion nationally often resist change locally. The contradictions erode faith in politics. Because residents see promises made but little delivered. A system that cannot adapt to meet basic needs appears broken, fueling cynicism and anger. Paris and Berlin offer a telling comparison of different approaches. Paris has long faced high demand and strict controls on growth. Its central districts are preserved with limited new construction, creating exclusivity. Prices climb and affordability suffers, especially for younger residents. Berlin, by contrast, historically maintained low rents through a large rental market and policies favoring tenants. This helped sustain diversity and openness. Yet as global demand reached Berlin, even its system came under strain. Rents rose, protests spread, and the city faced the same dilemmas of scarcity and resistance. The comparison shows that while policy choices matter, the refusal to expand supply ultimately catches up. Preservation of charm or stability comes at the price of inclusivity, whether in Paris's protected boulevards or Berlin's resistant neighborhoods. In the global south, the picture looks different, but linked by the same theme of arrested growth. Megacities like Lagos, Dhaka, or Jakarta grow explosively without the planning maturity needed to guide them. Populations soar, but infrastructure and housing lag far behind. Informal settlements expand, traffic overwhelms, and basic services fall short. Here, the refusal to grow up takes another form, not resistance to change, but failure to plan ahead. The result is a city that expands physically, but not institutionally. Growth becomes chaotic, producing inequality and vulnerability. Climate threats add to the strain, with flooding, heat, and pollution bearing down on populations already struggling. These cities show that refusing to adapt is not only a problem of wealthy regions defending exclusivity. It is also a problem of poor regions unable to match growth with maturity. In both cases, the outcome is fragility rather than resilience. The refusal to grow up creates self-reinforcing consequences. Economies become exclusive, societies divide along generational and class lines, climate goals slip out of reach, and politics harden into polarization. Silicon Valley symbolizes the paradox of innovation alongside paralysis. Paris and Berlin reveal the trade-offs of preservation and resistance. Global South megacities show what happens when growth is not guided into sustainable forms. Across these examples, the costs of stagnation are plain. The city that will not adapt ends up undermining the very qualities that once defined its strength. Cities that find themselves stuck in patterns of stagnation are not doomed to remain there. Change is possible, but it requires balancing the desire to preserve identity with the need to grow. The challenge lies in recognizing that preservation and growth are not opposites. A city can hold on to its culture and history while also adapting to meet the demands of the present. The pathway out of arrested development involves reforming zoning laws, coordinating across regions, investing in infrastructure, and creating policies that ease fears of displacement. Examples from cities that have faced similar pressures show that progress depends on building trust and addressing both the technical and social dimensions of change. One of the clearest levers is zoning reform. In many cities, single-family zoning and strict land use rules prevent new housing where it is most needed. Opening these areas to denser development expands supply and lowers pressure on prices. Reforms can take many forms, from legalizing duplexes and triplexes to lifting height restrictions near transit lines. The key is to allow flexibility so that housing can grow with demand. Inclusionary policies add another layer, requiring developers to set aside a portion of units for lower-income households. This ensures that new construction serves a wider range of residents. Not only the wealthy. By combining more permissive zoning with affordability requirements, cities can create growth that is both expansive and inclusive. Reforming these rules is politically difficult, but it strikes at the core of the supply problem that drives so many urban crises. Regional cooperation is another essential step. Many urban areas function as single economic units but are governed by dozens of municipalities, each with its own interests. This fragmentation produces paralysis, as seen in the Bay Area. Regional planning bodies with real authority can overcome local vetoes. Coordinating housing targets, transit expansion, and infrastructure investment across city and suburban lines ensures that the costs and benefits of growth are shared. When one town refuses to build housing, its neighbors carry the burden. Regional frameworks can balance these pressures, distributing responsibility more fairly. Successful models show that cooperation reduces duplication, speeds up projects, and strengthens resilience. Upgrading infrastructure is equally critical. Outdated utilities, congested roads, and aging transit systems act as bottlenecks. Investment in new infrastructure removes these constraints and makes density possible. Expanding metro lines, modernizing water and power grids, and building resilient flood protection all unlock the capacity for more people to live and work in the same space. Medellin in Colombia demonstrates how infrastructure investment can transform urban life. Once known for violence and inequality, the city invested in cable cars, public escalators, and libraries that connected poor hillside neighborhoods to the city center. These projects reduced isolation, opened access to jobs, and restored trust in public institutions. Infrastructure here was not only about technical systems, but also about bridging divides. It shows how targeted investment can shift a city from stagnation to renewal. Inclusive planning is the social counterpart to technical reform. Many residents resist change because they fear displacement. Renters worry that new construction will push them out, while homeowners worry about losing value. Addressing these fears directly is essential. Strong tenant protections, affordable housing programs, and community engagement can reduce opposition. Vienna offers an instructive model. For decades, the city has built and maintained a large supply of social housing. These units are well integrated into the urban fabric, not isolated in separate districts. They serve a wide range of incomes, which reduces stigma and ensures broad support. The effect is a city where residents feel secure in their housing, making them less resistant to change elsewhere. By providing stability, Vienna shows how inclusive planning can ease fears and create space for growth. Tokyo illustrates another approach through abundance. Unlike many Western cities, Tokyo allows extensive building across much of the city. Zoning laws are more flexible, and approval processes are faster. Developers can add housing in response to demand without years of hearings and appeals. The result is a steady supply of new units, which keeps prices relatively stable despite high population density. The city has preserved vibrant neighborhoods while also absorbing millions of residents. Tokyo's example shows that abundance itself can be a form of security. When housing is not scarce, fears of displacement lessen, and the city remains open to new people and ideas. The lesson is not that every city must copy Tokyo exactly, but that a system geared towards supply can avoid the vicious cycles of scarcity that trap other cities. These examples show that pathways out of stagnation exist, though they require trade-offs. Zoning reform challenges local traditions of preservation. Regional cooperation demands that municipalities surrender some autonomy. Infrastructure investment requires large financial commitments. Inclusive planning requires trust in public institutions. Yet the benefits are clear. Tokyo demonstrates how flexible planning sustains affordability. Vienna proves that social housing can provide security across classes. Medellin shows how infrastructure can overcome division and renew public faith. Each city took a different path, but all recognized that refusing to adapt carries higher costs than the risks of change. Cities that embrace these lessons can move beyond arrested development. They can protect identity without turning it into exclusion. They can expand housing without deepening inequality. They can modernize infrastructure while also strengthening communities. The tools exist, but they require both technical reform and cultural willingness to change. Where these align, stagnation can give way to resilience. And cities can grow into the future rather than remain trapped in the past. Cities rise because they bring people together. They thrive on exchange, density, and diversity. Yet, many of the most successful cities resist the very change that once gave them life. They freeze housing supply, block infrastructure upgrades, and preserve old patterns in the name of stability. What begins as a defensive charm or community identity turns into a refusal to adapt. The paradox is that prosperity makes cities fearful. The richer they grow, the less willing they become to take risks. Over time, this resistance becomes self-reinforcing, trapping cities in arrested development. The costs are visible everywhere. Economically, stagnation breeds exclusivity. San Francisco's tech industry generates immense wealth, yet its housing paralysis drives out workers and deepens inequality. Vancouver grows richer through global investment, but homes sit empty while locals struggle to find places to live. Socially, frozen cities harden generational divides. Older homeowners enjoy windfalls while younger residents face barriers to even modest stability. Inequality stretches across class and culture as working families are pushed farther from the centers of opportunity. Environmentally, the refusal to densify fuels sprawl and emissions. A family priced out of the urban core drives longer distances, adding to traffic and pollution. Cities that pride themselves on sustainability undermine their own climate goals by blocking the growth that could make them more efficient. Politically, frustration grows. Renters, homeowners, activists, and officials clash in cycles of protest and paralysis. Faith in institutions erodes when governments appear unable to deliver basic necessities like affordable housing and reliable transit. Examples across the world show the range of outcomes. The Bay Area has become the most famous symbol of a city region that refuses to evolve, protecting neighborhoods at the expense of regional vitality. Berlin demonstrates how tenant protections can defend affordability, but also stall growth when protests block new supply. Paris shows how preservation of beauty can create exclusivity, while cities in the global south struggle with the opposite problem: rapid expansion without the infrastructure to manage it. The contrasts highlight a single truth: adaptation is survival. Cities that resist risk turning into museums of themselves, attractive on the surface but hollowed within. Cities that embrace change remain dynamic, open, and resilient. The stakes reach beyond housing or planning. They cut to the heart of economic vitality, social justice, and environmental survival. A city that adapts can remain inclusive, offering opportunity across generations. A city that resists becomes brittle, leaving wealth locked in property values while shutting out those who might sustain its future. The choice is not between growth and identity, but between exclusion and renewal. The question, then, is one for all who live in cities. What kind of place do you want to call home? A monument to the past, where preservation turns into paralysis? Or a community with a future, willing to adapt so that it remains open, diverse, and alive?